Hey there, everybody. Welcome to my channel, The Magical Solution. My name is Lailani, and I'm really excited tonight because I have a guest whom I was following on Facebook. I follow a lot of espiritismo groups, spiritism groups, and I noticed how brilliant his comments were and his contributions and the blogs that he writes. And so much in my mind, I looked at him almost like just an encyclopedia of spiritism information. And, so I mustered up the courage to reach out to him and ask if he'd like to come on the show, because you guys specifically have been asking for more information on spiritualism, spiritism, espiritismo, and even the basics of being a psychic medium or healing or even ancestral veneration. It all is combined. It's all part of this narrative. And so tonight we have Stephen Patrick. So Stephen Patrick began his spiritual development in Southern California as a teenager, studying the works of Allan Kardec and developing his skills as a medium and a spiritualist. Now, Stephen had the privilege of serving as the historian and educating director for Plymouth Spiritualist Church, which is the oldest spiritualist church congregation in the United States and the mother church of modern spiritualism. Stephen taught monthly classes on the philosophy of spiritism and held bi-monthly discussion groups on various spiritualist topics. Stephen is currently the vice president and education director of the Rochester Spiritualist Society. Stephen is also Society's educator, director, and facilities discussion groups and classes on spiritual subjects. He runs his own practice as a spiritualist, where he offers spiritual consultations, classes, private coaching, and healing. Being the local historian that he is, where do you think he's from? Well, he's currently working and researching and documenting the history of the spiritualist movement right there in Rochester, which we will get into tonight. But that's enough. That's enough talking. Let's bring him on.
Hello.
Hey.
I'm so excited to be here.
Welcome. I'm excited you're here. Honestly, like when I was kind of watching you online, I was like, oh my God, this person's so brilliant. And then when you asked me to like go to your blogs and like, read up on what you've written, I was like, holy shit, I didn't know it was like this. So so it was wonderful getting a chance to talk to you on the phone and getting a chance, because like it was like going into a candy shop. Yes. to have someone who knows all that. It's so great.
Did we just become best friends?
All right, I gotta stop fangirling. So let's get into it. So spiritualism. Let's start off first with what exactly American spiritualism is.
Okay. So American spiritualism is a spiritualist group of spiritualist traditions that developed in the United States, because as we'll talk about later, it developed totally differently in different parts of the world. So American spiritualism, the like kind of hallmark things about it is that there's like spiritualist churches and also spiritualist camps, which are like little villages filled with spiritualists. So that's like Lilydale and Casadega in Florida and stuff like that. And they're all over the United States.
They are. There's a lot of them.
It's shocking. There's a lot more than most people realize.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah. So in terms of American spiritualism, you had mentioned just now that it had popped up among other spiritualism.
Right.
So I know when you described spiritualism to begin with, because my history was wrong about this. And this is where you corrected me, because I always thought that the spiritualism kind of started in the Americas and made its way to Europe, then went to the Caribbean, and then made its way back to the Americas, which kind of, and in that movement, there was like so many additions and stuff like that. But it turns out that there was some sort of collective consciousness going around the planet, because it seemed like spiritualism popped up in various parts of the world, like kind of around the same time.
Yeah, you weren't wrong. there was sort of like both of those things happening. Um, do you want me to get into all of that?
Do it. Yes.
Well, one of the things I think that's just really important to keep in mind with the beginning of like the spiritualist movement is that this was like the late 1800s. Like one of the like date that a lot of people give is like 1848, but it was around that time period. And there was so much change going on in the world at that time that it was just insane. So like a lot of religious movements, not just spiritualism, that popped up around that time were for the first time actually influenced on like a global scale, because we started to have like the telegraph was created, all of these other things, like phones first started eventually popping up, all these other like technological things started happening, like photography was like a new thing.
Yeah.
And so all of these huge innovations were kind of coming in right around this time, that there was sort of just this like things were like veering that way, from like other different places. And so what ended up happening was so do you want me to get into the terms now? Because like I feel like I should. Okay.
Yeah, no, we should. And because when you go through the history, I feel like the history is so dense that you need to be familiar with the terminology. And I know one of the biggest things with regards to the terminology within the subject is this sort of
so we'll start with the boring
and
stuff
spiritualist. Yeah, can you describe that whole
better? So like one of the big issues I think that happens when talking about just spiritualism and spiritism and espiritismo in general is that there's a lot of terms that are like they mean different things at different times in different places to different people, and no one up until recently has really ever kind of delved into this. And so you get these terms that aren't wrong, they're just used differently by different people. So like you have like being like spiritual, which is just any kind of spirituality. Like anyone of any faith, of any religion, of any tradition can be spiritual. Like Hindu, pagan, indigenous, Muslim, Christian, anyone can be spiritual. There's also this is where it gets weird. There's also like spiritualism and spiritism with like a little s, where that sort of means just like the phenomena of mediumship, like generic mediumship from the beginning of time to now, like any tradition at all. And so then you have the spiritualist movement, which was an actual like historical, religious, philosophical movement that started actually in the United States, here in upstate New York. Funny enough, both kind of in Rochester and Poughkeepsie. And it like kind of just exploded as like a world movement. Like it went from being like basically just a local ghost story into like a full-blown religious tradition. So the spiritualist movement encompasses all of these different traditions. So like American spiritualism, spiritism, spiritismo, all have a root in that, because like there's other roots that go into it from like indigenous religions and other sorts of things, but like a root is like they all kind of go back to that historical movement. So I guess I'll just do really brief little things of what happened. So like the movement is always like it tends to the beginning point, or like the advent of spiritualism, tends to be associated with this event that took place actually just a couple miles outside of Rochester, up here in upstate New York. For those of you who don't know, Rochester is like in between Buffalo and Syracuse on Lake Ontario. So this there were these young girls living in this town called Hydesville, and they were the Fox sisters, and it was they were like 14 and 11, I think, maybe even a little bit younger. Their names were Kate and Maggie, and one night they basically communicated with a ghost that was haunting their house, because at the time it was very much perceived of as like this is like a haunting, this is a ghost
Right.
story. Like it hadn't quite gotten anything beyond like a haunted farmhouse. But what happened was they like created this little system of knocks, sort of like knock once for yes, knock two for no. And then eventually they turned it into like, we're going to read the alphabet out loud and you are going to like knock at the number of the alphabet that you want the word to be on. And they found out this whole story of how it was like a spirit of like a traveling like peddler, like a salesman that was murdered in their house. And it became this huge local story, and they were getting a lot of unwanted attention. It was, mind you, it wasn't that modern, so people were like throwing around accusations of them being like a witch and stuff like that. Like it was still late 1800s.
And it's not that far removed from that either.
And so they were sent to Rochester to live with their oldest sister, Leah Fox. And so and they thought that would like end all the knockings and everything would just go away. These spirit rappings followed them to Rochester into Leah's house, and it was full blown like furniture being moved, like all of these knock noises. And their neighbor, who was their neighbor was this man named Isaac Post and his wife Amy Post, who were two very prominent progressive Quaker individuals in Rochester. And the neighbor was sort of like, well, you tried the alphabet at the other house, why don't we try it here and see what happens? And so Leah was sort of like, what do you want? Like, what are you telling us? And so everything stopped, and these knockings came out that told them basically, this is like, we need you to bring this message to the world. And it instructed them to rent this hall that was here in Rochester, Corinthian Hall. It's like a big lecture hall. And they had, and the two younger sisters, accompanied by Amy and Isaac Post and Leah, went to publicly demonstrate mediumship in front of people. Like they brought through spirits and messages, and nothing like this had ever happened before. And news of this spread everywhere, everywhere. And again, at the time, it was almost like things were being prepped for this, because there were these other movements and other things around the time where people were starting to like look into psychic phenomena and stuff like that. So it wasn't like they invented mediumship. It was more like they said, like, we can do this. This is happening. You can too. And so it just spread.
And that it's somewhat of a divine ordinance as well.
Like, yeah. Leah Fox actually, she wrote an autobiography, which is in the public domain. And she described it in terms of like almost like a religious conversion. Like the idea that spirits are there and our loved ones still exist was like just this huge deal. And so and that was when it pretty much turned into this big movement where people started investigating things. And so at that time, still late 1800s, but still early in the movement, it started to spread to England, first to England, and then eventually to France. And the movement at that time was very unorganized. It was people who were like interested in this stuff, very interested in like psychic phenomena and healing and all these things. And people were just sort of like experimenting with things and trying to see what was like going on. That's where like we get that phrase of like little s spiritualism, where it was like the actual phenomenon that was occurring. So like, you know, mediumship, healing, astral projection, whatever. And so in Europe, in France, a educator who went by the pen name Allan Kardec was very fascinated with this stuff that he was seeing going on. A lot of people were doing this for like entertainment, like, you know, like table tipping. They're basically just trying to see like what they could do, you know, like when like kids like with a Ouija board, it's like, we're gonna contact a spirit. Like it was like a mix of that, and it was like other people trying to figure out what was going on, but it was really unorganized. And so Kardec, with his whole story, he like interviewed all of these different mediums. There's much more to it than that.
Wait,
this is a very like abbreviated version of it. And then he composed the Spiritist codification on based on his findings. And what he wanted to do at the time was he wanted to distance this philosophical understanding of spiritualism from like this unorganized movement. And so he called his movement Spiritism. And then eventually, the other thing that's actually really fascinating about Kardec was that he really had like a global mindset, like at the time. A lot of other people didn't. And whatever, I know everyone has very mixed opinions on it, but whatever their opinions are, he really wanted like this message to go to everyone. Right. And so like almost from the beginning, like he started translating the books. He himself translated a few of them. I think he actually translated the one in Spanish and German, but then his disciples and followers who were also spiritists also started translating. So they were in Spanish and German and Italian and Portuguese, and
but it traveled all over the world.
Yeah,
it just went
so
crazy.
Right. And so individuals from the Caribbean, all, not even just the Caribbean, the individuals from the Caribbean, North America, South America, Central America, got in contact with these books by various means, either in Europe, where they were basically brought as contraband to like some of these places because it was illegal, and they kind of took root, and in a whole, because that's a whole nother thing, but spiritism was adapted by different people in different ways in the Caribbean to create like spiritismo in all of its different forms, because there's tons of, just as there's lots of different forms of spiritualism, there's a lot of different forms of spiritismo. And I do think it's funny because usually like when people do say espiritismo, at least online, I feel like we kind of think of like a very specific kind, but there's there's way more to it than that.
Yeah, I was actually dumbfounded a little bit to find out that there's such a thing as eclectic spiritualism.
Yeah.
And that like kind of was like, wait.
It's not eclectic enough. But then, so while all of that was happening in Europe and going to the Caribbean, in the United States, this unorganized spiritualism became organized. But the big difference was they didn't have, they for a lot of reasons, Kardec's books were not that popular in America. A lot of it was like a language issue and some other things, but there's just a whole reason why. So Kardec, in the past, was not that influential on the shaping of American Spiritism. They had their own figures that organized and shaped it into this tradition. And I think one of the things that's confusing is that American spiritualists just call their tradition spiritualism. Sometimes it's called modern spiritualism, modern spiritualism could be kind of applied to like the spiritualism that developed in the United States and then went to a lot of the other English-speaking countries, because like modern spiritualism is also very popular in England and like Australia and like those places. But like American spiritualism, I think, is a bit better of a term when we're talking about American style spiritualism, because modern spiritualism is like a specific kind of American spiritualism. There's so many like terms, and the thing that's crazy is you can use the phrase spiritualist for all of these people.
Yeah,
because like even Kardec, my favorite thing to quote from him that he wrote in one of his books is that all spiritists are spiritualists, but not all spiritualists are spiritists.
Right.
So that's the boring part.
Now, speaking of influential people within the American spiritualist movements, who are some of them, and how, like, where? Okay, here's a better way of saying this, because we know that Allan Kardec, his agenda with spiritism, right, kind of came from this rebellion against the church, and more so, to bring in sort of that scientific philosophical mind. What was the fuel that like pushed American spiritualism?
I really like that question. There was a lot of fuel. So like at the time, so like in France, Kardec wasn't in a bubble. He was working with, like you said, like the Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and stuff like that. and positivism, and also just a sense of like the Catholic Church is evil. that was basically his set, which is funny because you definitely can see that there was a lot of influence also in there. So in the United States, some of the big kind of influences that came in were they're actually, so a lot of people, I think when people think of like early America, they don't really realize that occult things and metaphysical things were actually that popular. But they were. And so there were a lot of like alternative religions going on at the time. And like, so a lot of those came in, like the two biggest ones, in at least in how it developed in terms of like doctrine, was teachings from this Swedish mystic that became very popular in English translations in the United States. It was Emanuel Swedenborg. And he wrote all sorts of very, like, very, he thought he was a Christian, but like people did not think he was, because he taught things that were very different from Christianity. But he was really into like psychic phenomenon and angels and stuff like that. And then the other kind of branch that influenced things was mesmerism, which is a form of energy healing, which is awesome because it is 100% preserved in Espiritismo, spiritualism, and spiritism. Like they still practice that. So those branches kind of came in, and then like a lot of like liberal forms of like Christianity that were like kind of seen as like evil by like basically all the forms of Christianity that like pissed off the other churches kind of came in there. So you have all of this very progressive liberal stuff kind of going on. And the thing that kind of really pushed everything together though was Andrew Jackson Davis, which is not the same as President Andrew Jackson, who was a monster, like two totally different people. And Andrew Jackson Davis was from Poughkeepsie, New York.
Woo!
And he was known
as
Poughkeepsie seer. And the only way I can best describe him is he was like a 1800s version of Edgar Cayce, like incredibly similar. And so he was considered like, so he came up with his whole philosophy and metaphysics and spirituality about basically dealing with spiritualism. And that like wholesale was put into the structure of American spiritualism. Not exactly how it was with Kardec though, because Kardec, like people to this day, like treat that almost like the Bible, like it is studied religiously and devoutly, and even for those people who may not really even like him, like a lot of his prayers are still used. But with Andrew Jackson Davis, it was more of the structure that was borrowed. So like people very rarely read his books anymore, and they're horrible. Like they're so dry. They make Kardec look like fun, like to read. Like it's like someone dropped like a ton of acid and then read Kardec. So American spiritualism doesn't have a unified set of books, which is interesting because it's where you get a lot of diversity in how things are taught, but there's still a structure, which I can talk about if you want.
I definitely want to lay out what sort of the core tenets are.
Yeah.
But going back to sort of like the famous contributors of
So
from what I'm hearing with the spiritism, right, is it's much more culturally influenced, right? There's a lot of separation, and basically I still feel the Catholic Christian piece to it.
Yeah.
But you can tell it's like not really. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So spiritualism kind of has that too. So it kind of, the way it kind of formed was, and I'll talk about the people that wrote and founded things too. American spiritualism from the onset kind of had people who followed Andrew Jackson Davis's teachings, which became more like modern spiritualism, which is very not that Christian. It's like Christian, it sees spiritualism as a natural occurring religion, and that the inspiration that's in other religions are all connected because they're like spiritualism. So like
Right.
so he talks about Jesus as being like a really important figure, but then he also goes on to, like, you know, Moses and Muhammad, and like he even goes into like religions that you wouldn't even think people would be talking about back then, like
Mm,
Zoroastrianism, and like and
yeah.
even like the pagan philosophers like Socrates and stuff like that.
I
That
remember
kind of,
also too the Western esoteric movement kind of they both kind of like bled into each other
oh
as
yeah,
well.
they there was a ton of that. So
Yeah.
so you have those those people, and there were his like, I don't want to say disciples, but there were people who followed in his footsteps. So like another the funny thing is, like, a lot of these spiritualist figures are very like really big figure, like I don't know how to put this in a polite way, like like they're just kind of like wacky out of they like there's these things in their lives that are just like crazy, like 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 one of my favorites is Cora LV Scott, and she was like a spiritualist missionary that went around the country. um she she would go into trance and she would give lectures about spiritualism. With her guides would give these lectures, and she had been doing this since she was like 16. And it was a big deal because at the time people are like, she's a woman talking to a crowd of men unaccompanied, like she's a weird,
Right.
like, and so
Yeah.
it was pretty brave of her to do that, because there was no, because women were women in most churches could not be leaders, like, at all. Like, it was like, just, it could not happen. Women couldn't even vote. um so like a lot of these women and men who were spiritualists were very involved with these movements as well, like the abolitionist movement, women's suffrage, things like that. But one of the just kind of fun things about Cora is that she had like 6 husbands. And so and she kept
Ooh.
every single one of their names, and so like if you see her name written out, it's like,
Oh my
I don't
God.
even know. It's like Cora, Leota, Veronica, Scott, Richmond, Hatch, Taffet. Like,
But
um,
you know, so this is I think this is amazing because it's so quote unquote American at its core. You know what I mean? There's this sense of empowerment through spiritualism that empowers individuals
yes,
to use their abilities, and in using those abilities there's prerequisites before that too. Like you have to learn discernment, you have to learn certain
right.
things. Like there's stuff that just simply makes you a better human being.
I
And so like to have those gifts, it seems like the spiritualist movement in America was like one person here and there who showed their gift. Like you explained Cara, and you explained, you
yeah,
know,
like
Andrew.
the spiritualist movement in America is like fiercely independent. And that's why
Yeah,
it's so hard to get a group of spiritualists to like explain what they believe, because it's like herding cats.
right,
um
right.
and like um I think you hit a point there. There was actually a lot of spiritists in Europe who were like kind of looking in on American spiritualism. It was funny. One of the things that they would always say is like that the American mediums tended to actually be more developed than the mediums that in Europe at the time, but they were like not organized at all. Like, because they were like they do well if they actually read books. um, right.
Ain't that a fact?
um,
I think that
but
still
yeah,
holds
like
true.
there's a very loose, common, simple structure that's in American spiritualism. That's really it's funny because it's not as bookish as Spiritism, and I love books, but like, but it's not as bookish because I think there's a lot more emphasis on development than there is on necessarily studying, which is both good and bad, because I think studying is really important.
Yeah,
But there isn't a lot. It's not that there isn't a lot to study, it's that there's so much to study,
right.
because with Kardec you have the spirits books. In America you have like people pumping out books on spiritualism. It was almost like there were too many of them.
Mm.
um and so one of the things I think, kind of going to bring in some of the confusion from earlier, was a lot of people they tend to think that American spiritualism is basically just mediumship. Like, there's nothing else. Like, it's having a seance and stuff like that. And there actually is like a whole diverse amount of like teachings and philosophy. They tend to be more, I think, simpler in how they're organized, but they can get pretty deep, and it's really an interesting tradition.
I would think that, if you have a core set of tenets, or if you have a core structure that's simple but yet impactful, I think that can be enough of a bone structure to allow for the variety that spiritualism offers.
And that's one of the wonderful things about it.
Yeah.
It's that because it's so simple, and they're simple but powerful. You have all of these different diverse traditions of spiritualism, and it is nuts because, like, so Cuba, for example, Cuba has a ton of forms of spiritismo, like a ton of them. Like, and there's the whole spectrum of it, from like the Kardecists, like the scientific ones, to like Cruzado, mixed with everything that you can imagine. And then there's other ones in between, like is it Caridad? Like
Caridad,
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and then the other ones too. American spiritualism, and it's in Cuba, it's a relatively small island. American spiritualism is that times like 1,000, because you not only do you have like not the organization of Kardec, but you have these leaders that are independently teaching different kinds of spiritualism. So it's so diverse and so like interesting, yet everyone can kind of come together with a few basic agreements on what ties everything together.
Which are?
I can discuss that. So one of the other things that I think is really interesting is that Kardec's books, were written in like Victorian times.
Yeah.
Spiritualism also started then, but the real like development of when it started to develop was actually more like the 1920s. And so spiritualist books moved away from that really like wordy Victorian stuff, and they're much more closer to, a lot of those like early like really popular like self-help books, like
yes.
I'm trying to like the power of positive thinking,
yes.
or like
the power of now, and
like their spiritualism sort of reformed itself as being like practical, simple, and like something that everyone can understand, which is the exact opposite of Andrew Jackson Davis. So basically, it puts itself up as a religion, philosophy, and science, and in the sense that you can approach spiritualism from those perspectives. You can be really philosophical, you can be more like, you could be more Christian influenced, or you could come at it from a scientific way of thinking, and that all of those are okay and the same thing. They're just different ways of looking at it. I think another important thing is the idea of kind of like God is usually described as like infinite intelligence, which is very similar to how Kardec explains it. And it's kind of like this idea that God is sort of like this natural force that runs through everything, very like pantheistic kind of, where it's more like God isn't like an old man that lives in the sky. Like, God is like a natural force that's in everything and runs through everything. Jumping off of that, there's this idea of like natural laws, again, also in Kardec, but I think expressed less Victorian-y. So like, it's the idea that the things that are important, like how we live our lives and interact with each other, are like naturally occurring parts of the world. Like we don't need to like look to like some kind of divine revelation, because it's all around us. And so spiritualism is very, very has a very positive view of the physical world, which I actually think Kardec doesn't. He has it, but it's almost like it doesn't come across that well. The
It
idea,
really doesn't.
yeah.
And he even discusses animals like they are like subpar. Like there's
Yeah,
this
like,
whole,
oh god,
yeah.
spiritualism loves animals, and that's a whole nother. But the idea that like your body and other bodies and the world is not only good but actually like part of the spirit world. So like getting into this, the next part is like what is commonly, I love this one, which is commonly, this teaching is called the ministry of angels. And it's a little holdover from Christianity, but by angels they actually mean spirit guides. They don't necessarily mean like ethereal, like angelic beings like Saint Michael or something. They more mean like angel, like, oh, they died and they're an angel now, like kind of like that. um and this idea is that the spirit world is part of the physical world. It's just a different material, like it's like a more refined kind of material, which, you know, with science now we get into that, there's like dimensions and all
Exactly.
sorts of things.
I love that you use the word refined. That's
Yeah.
so perfect.
The idea, the spiritualists used to say like this, like the spheres, there's different
Yes.
spheres. And then, so understanding that there is a spirit world, then you have mediumship and healing that are natural occurring things. They're not like supernatural. They're not supernatural in the sense that it's like, you know, the laws of nature stop so that this can happen. Like it's something that occurs within our bodies, within the natural world. And that these gifts are, that spiritualism actually promotes the idea that everyone has these gifts, but maybe not in the same way or in the same degree. So like because you have a soul, and because you have ancestors and guides and you have a connection to God, you therefore have these so that you can communicate and connect with these ancestors. You may just not, it may just be for you. Like it may not be that you're called to serve as like a specific kind of medium. You may just be a medium just for you.
So time out. So this explains, it really does. It explains why all over TikTok everyone identifies as a spiritualist. And I mean like everyone. Like I would see hoodoo practitioners, I would see Appalachian practitioners, I would see pagans, I would see just plain old evidential mediums. I would see all these various occultists who identify as spiritualists. And when you said you can look at it from either science, religion, or philosophy, because it transmutes all three languages. It just you can speak in any of those languages and you're still talking about spiritualism.
Right.
And so like that shit blew my fucking mind, bro.
I think the only part, um I'm part of the Rochester Spiritualist Society, which is a spiritualist group here in Rochester that I helped co-found with a group of wonderful people. And one of the things that we kind of are trying to move towards is a more open idea of things, because one of the things that happens, as it does with every tradition, is that there is that openness, like of everyone being able to have these gifts. But like you have some organizations that are like, you can have these gifts, but only in the ways we say they can exist. And so we're trying to be like, no, you have a gift. Full stop. Like
Period, point blank.
Yeah, if you agree with these few things, then you are a spiritualist. If you do other things, perfectly fine. That doesn't negate you being a spiritualist.
Right. That makes so much sense now. Because I was like, what's happening?
Yeah, and that's why in American spiritualism, if you go to like two different churches, they can be insanely different. You could go to like the one I used to go to here, it's very much like modern spiritualism. It's the inside of the church is very like plain, but not like in an ugly way. Like it's very like it was very plain. There's candles. It's very calm. It's probably more like what you'd see in like a Kardec spiritist center, like very soft colors. and like there's not a ton of rituals. Like more of that kind of thing. Most of the rituals were like private. There weren't a ton of them. It was very very kind of lit, calm. Like that's the feeling you get when you go there.
That's the best
You go to another church, because there's two churches here in Rochester, and then my group, which is like an independent spiritualist society. You go to the other church, there are statues of the Virgin Mary, Sacred Heart of Jesus, Native American spirit guides. There's a statue of Buddha. They sing Christian hymns. They read the Bible, but then they also are doing the exact same kind of mediumship and stuff like that. Very kind of like, well, not exactly, but like those were kind of like the spiritualism you saw like in New Orleans that a lot of people are obsessed with. Like with Mother Lethe Anderson and all those churches were like full ritual and all of that. And it's wonderful because they are both spiritualists and they can exist in the same sphere.
Right. In the same sphere as hoodoo, in the same sphere as voodoo, in the same sphere as Christianity. All that was happening in New Orleans. It's just so great. It's so great.
and even like in other cities too, wherever. So spiritualism was actually it still kind of is, but not as much. Spiritualism was a very urban religion. Like it was a very, very, very urban religion. Like, there used to be a ton of spiritualist churches in like cities. Not as much anymore, but some cities still have a ton of spiritualist churches. Rochester doesn't have that much anymore, but I know San Diego has like 6. Like it's just weird. But like,
so really quick, like, okay, usually when people think of a church, and I know you mentioned sometimes they call it center or templo, but usually when you think of a church, you think of an altar and you think of, people in like lots of prayer or singing some kind of song. So, and it's usually around a particular message within those doctrines. Now, because spiritualism doesn't really have doctrines, doesn't really have founders, what is the gathering? What does that look like?
So spiritualist churches are like the more organized form of American spiritualism. So what you'll have is most spiritualist churches will publish like a spiritualist manual. And what that'll have is it'll have that particular church's teachings in it. For those who know my Instagram, I like collect them, and I have like 1 billion of them from like different time periods. So if you ever want to look at an example of one, you can do that. But so it'll have like what they stand for. It'll list usually there's like a declaration of principles which outline things, and it'll have like inspiring passages to read and sermons and stuff like that. So churches especially will have like some kind of document or teaching manual where you can have like a central kind of thing. But it's interesting. It's sort of like when spiritualism was developing, people simultaneously wanted to get away from older church things, but didn't want to give stuff up.
Right.
And so you have like a very broad spectrum of like what they were willing to give up. For instance, if you read like there's different also spiritualists publish hymnals, because there's a whole thing with like singing hymns and songs and stuff like that in spiritualism. But if you read them, they'll be like the typical ones, but usually like the Jesus parts are taken out.
Oh my God.
So like they'll usually say the word like spirit, like to mean plural, or angels or something. And so the hymns will be like the familiar hymns, but they will have the churchy parts taken out.
Okay, all right. Hey, you do what you gotta do, right?
Right. And then of course there is like full blown like spiritualism that identifies as being Christian spiritualism.
Right.
Which is not what most people would think. but they'll usually leave stuff like that in, despite the fact that most Christians would probably.
And that's usually the one. The Christian spiritualism is usually the one that's very popular in terms of being seen.
Right.
You know what I mean? So a lot of people just assume spiritualism is Christian based.
Right. I kind of fall somewhere in there, like closer to that, just because like Christian spiritualism is where like you'll have like the saints and like, but you'll also have your spirit guides. It would fall a lot closer to, I think, what most people who are familiar with like Spiritismo Cruzado or like some forms of like Creole, like Puerto Rican type spiritualism, like
Right.
they'd probably be more familiar with that type of thing, where you
Right.
see like the big statues of like the saints with like the candles and everything.
Yeah. Which reminds me, you know, oh, we have Stephen here. Sorry. I meant to pull up this question. Was there an order in the services that you do in the churches?
They do vary. There's certain elements that are in every service, but they in what order they come in is a little bit different.
Different for each one.
The main three is healing, some kind of inspirational talk, which is usually about spiritualism, and then the last part is usually evidential mediumship. And the mediumship that is publicly demonstrated in churches tends to be more like clairvoyant style of it, because the messages you get in the church are not exactly the same as what you'd get in like a seance, which is much more like a misa. Like in a church, you'd more get like they're usually called like a greeting, like a spirit greeting,
or like a blessing or
yeah,
something.
or like a blessing, where it's sort of like the medium is like, I'm getting such and such a spirit. They give whatever details they can, like this is what they look like, this is what their name, if they're real good, this is what their name is. And then they'll be like, and they have this message to give you, and it's usually something really, I mean, I think a lot of people make fun of it because a lot of these messages are just simply like that they love you, like, but
right.
Some people really need that. Yeah. Like I have seen people just full breakdown because they needed to hear that like their loved one was there, like and needed them. So you kind of have all of this fit into like a little hour long service.
Wow.
Which I love, because it gives people who are interested in it, or maybe even interested in developing their mediumship, a chance to like kind of experience things without having to go right into like some of the more like intense stuff. Because like,
so to be a member of the spiritualist movements in whatever capacity, because again it depends on which place you go, but is there a requirement to be a psychic medium, or to be a healer, or to be a philosopher, or to like, is there a requirement to play a certain role that you have open and available?
The short answer is no. The long answer is that again, spiritualism basically puts the idea that everyone has a spiritual gift, or lots of them. And so if you go to, what'll often happen is you'll go to the church and you'll start developing really quickly.
So true.
Like when especially if you go to like the Sunday services and stuff like that, you're with so many people and there's so much like energy going on that we have a lot of people like, they like start experiencing things like real quick that they had never had before. Like maybe they had a dream once in a while or something like that, but then like all of a sudden they like see like a spirit like up there, or they might find that they might have a gift for it. But like I said, sometimes your gift is just for you, and like you have that ability to connect to your guides and your ancestors, and that may be all you need. But the other kind of nice part with this a church as like a community is you have other ways to serve too, because you can volunteer to help people. You can like with all sorts of things. Like we my group, although we don't have like a permanent location right now, we do have places that we meet like regularly, and sometimes people bring in food to donate. We have a regular canned food drive that's just ongoing. Like that's just if people want to donate. And it's just a way to participate, because spirituality isn't just mediumship. It's also like taking care of people.
And you know what I really love? You know what I really love about just spiritualism, spiritism, espiritismo, just this idea overall. And I don't know if I asked you this already, but there was a point in history or a rumor, I'm not even sure at this point, if that spiritualism was about heaven and another side after we die versus spiritism being about reincarnation. And I'm wondering is that accurate or is that a rumor? Like,
so
that seems to be floating around.
So like so many things, it's like yes to both. And so what happened was American style spiritualism as a whole tended to not embrace reincarnation. They felt that these early spiritualists felt that you developed as a spirit on the other side, and you would progress spiritually, but just as a spirit. And in Kardec promoted reincarnation. He basically taught the same thing, but he also included reincarnation.
Okay.
But a good amount of spiritualists, not the majority, but a decent amount of them, did believe in reincarnation as well. And I'm sort of like trying to actually what is one of my projects for history is to see if this was influenced by spiritism or not, which I think in some cases it may have been. But
American spiritualism specifically, that's going to be really hard to pinpoint because again, there were so many influences.
Right, but there's certain weird things that make it a little bit interesting. So, for instance, one point about that is that the Christian spiritualists tended to be the ones that believed in reincarnation. So that's one weird part. The other thing that I think you might find fun is that New York State in particular had the biggest amount of spiritualists that believed in reincarnation for some reason. And this is talking the 1800s, 1900s, and things like that. So for whatever reason, New York State really was much more open to it than it used to be. Now, and mind you, this was quite a few years back. I would say going into the 1940s, things started to shift in American spiritualism. And now people who don't believe in reincarnation at this point as spiritualists are in the minority. And that's, I think, arguably being influenced by a lot of, on one hand, you have spiritist books coming in from Brazil that are being translated, and also just this new awareness of espiritismo. A lot of people are becoming familiar with both of those, and they very much have reincarnation as kind of an element to it, and it's becoming kind of more and more popular. And on the other hand, it's also kind of creating a little bit of a revival of people interested in spiritualism, because I think a lot of people will they'll feel a pull towards Cuban or Puerto Rican spiritismo and stuff, and it may be that they had ancestors that were spiritualists, maybe from somewhere else, and they were believing and doing almost the exact same kind of thing, and that could be them kind of pushing them towards something that they recognize as that tradition. So it's the spirits got everything moving again.
Exactly. And that brings me back to my original point, where what I love about spiritualism and spiritism and espiritismo is that it's a forward-thinking spirituality. It's a forward-thinking philosophy. It's a forward-thinking, a science in terms of seeing the natural world, right? And in that forward thinking, especially coming out of the boomer generation, surviving those parents and then the kids of those parents that were also fucked up, you know what I mean? Where it's both of those generations were generations of selfish, I'm going to take as much as I can, and I'm going to close the door behind me kind of attitude. So now we're entering this new sort of age where people are starting to say to myself, oh, wow, the world is crumbling around me. Like, my actions do matter. Like, I have to think of the future. I can't just think about me right now. And spiritualism really kind of offers that in a safe space, because you know you're going to keep coming back, and you know you have to grow, and you know your brother has to grow, right? And it's just constantly pushing each other forward. Do you know what I mean?
I think, because this is the historian in me, I think one of the things that's also good to keep in mind is that the times now being as they are, when spiritualism started, it was horrible. Like, I mean, horrible. Like, the world was a horrible, horrible place. It was like just the slavery was still a thing. Like, I mean, it still is, but it was like in American, you know what I mean? In America, it was like people were fighting over slavery. Women had no rights. Barely anyone had rights unless you were like a straight white male of a specific class and a specific nationality and ethnicity. And spiritualism came out of that horrible, horrible time period with this incredibly optimistic view, saying like, we need to come together and look forward.
Yes.
And it's still saying that, and it's still relevant.
It's baby, I don't even, that's it. That's where it is right there. Because I want to talk to you forever. I still have a million more questions, and the audience still has a million more questions too.
Do you want to pick like a quick question or something?
Yeah. I mean, we have, let's see, they were more like comments about your original core tenets of spiritualism. So when you were talking about, the science aspect of it, someone commented this, there's pieces to what you were talking about. Now, this question, I'm actually curious about too. This was earlier on in the live. Was NLP and the healing children from spiritism or spiritualism? So I'm not sure what she's talking. I know NLP is like a form of like hypnotism and being able to manipulate conversation and getting people to say what you want them to say, because you have like, there's certain words and stuff. I don't know.
In that era of the 1920s, a lot of different like mental sciences came out, where it was like thought healing and color healing, all these different things. And like, it was, I wouldn't say that it came out of spiritualism, but it came out of like the same bubble.
Well, because remember the era, we're talking about the hippie era, we're talking about free thought era too.
So like a lot of those things that came into like those mental things go back to earlier things from the 1920s, where they have similar roots, but like it may not have been right there. Spiritualism definitely influenced the New Age movement, but I have some issues with that. Where it was more like, because with like spiritualism is like a complete system, and the New Age movement sort of just pick and chose from different systems.
The New Age movement is that movie, The Secret. That's the New Age movement. That's where where it came from, and it's awful. And what sucks is, that's another thing. I'm glad you actually brought that up. What sucks is like there is a wave of thinking that modern spiritualism is just simply the revival of supremacy, white supremacy, and all this other stuff, and Christian this and I'm just like, damn, you guys are getting the blame for this. Like, that sucks.
Like, so spirit, and it also goes back to that whole thing of like, people, like, the word spiritualism means like a million different things. And so like, it's a complicated thing, and you really have to like nitpick like what different terms and stuff mean.
So Stephen, I have to ask, if you were to have someone come up to you and say, I'm a reconnecting Puerto Rican, or I'm a reconnecting whatever, because there's a lot of overlay with ancestor stuff, which I would love to get into as well. But if you had someone that said that, I'm a reconnecting Puerto Rican who I have an ancestor situation where I want to honor my ancestors, but you know, they're super Catholic or they're super Christian, and I have trauma with that, and like I feel like I can't connect with them. You know, is there a place for me? Would spiritualism be able to speak to that, since this idea of spirit guides and speaking to your deceased loved ones is central to your practice?
Yeah, spiritualism is like kind of how I explained with like the religion, philosophy, and science. So spiritualism is sort of, I guess, you can. I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this. The practices of spiritualism in a spiritualist context are for the living. So the thing that the dead or the spirits of the dead need are elevation and prayer and healing. The way you do that by a spiritualist context doesn't really matter. So like if you don't feel comfortable using Christian symbolism and things, you don't have to in spiritualism. In fact, like in my group, there's a whole spectrum. Like I said, because it's an independent spiritualist group, so we have a whole spectrum of people from all sorts of different backgrounds and different experiences with what different cultures or different churches may have, what trauma may have wreaked havoc with that. And so you don't have to have like that Christian Catholic element if it traumatizes you. You can set up like if you want to set up an altar, you can set up an altar, and it doesn't have to have Christian stuff on it. It can just have candles or water. Spiritualist altars are a little bit more freeform than Boveda does, but they do have a system. So you can have that experience, and you don't even like a lot of the prayers in spiritualism tend to actually just be like affirmations. like you can use Christian prayers, but you don't have to. You can have things be in a system that feels comfortable to you. On the other hand, one thing that I kind of like, and again, I did not have this experiences that a lot of people had with Catholicism and things like that, and so I'm very mindful of that. So I would never recommend someone who felt uncomfortable like, no, you have to pray to like the saints and stuff like that. But the spiritualist take on that is that they put themselves at like a distance from what so one of my favorite authors of spiritualism was he was actually the first pastor of the one Spiritualist Church that I used to go to here in Rochester in like the 1900s, and he wrote this little pamphlet about spiritualism, and he said that there was a difference between the pure and simple teachings of Jesus of Nazareth and the teachings of churchianity. And so a lot of the people who do practice a form of Christian spiritualism see themselves as sort of like that stuff that is bad, the controlling things and all of that is not what we're doing, and we're taking back this good, beautiful spiritual stuff, and we're the ones that like this belongs to us. Like these spirit guides and the saints, they belong to us, they're part of us, and they're not tools to like use against other people. So there's so depending on what way you want to go, because you know, some people may want to go back into that with the saints and stuff for ancestral reasons, but you don't have to. Like there's room for everyone at the table.
I love it. I love it. So my last question to you for tonight, before we get to know, you know, what it is that you're working on and how people can reach you and how people can contact you. My last question would be, you know, are there any last words that you would like to leave the audience or to the people watching this on replay, or even to just inquiring minds?
I think something that I feel is like just a really important part of spiritualism, and it's something that I think, especially with like a lot of with the way that the internet works in this world of like getting rich quick schemes and people like buying titles to call themselves things, I think one of the things that gets passed by is this the fact that spiritualism is really all about spiritual development, and your development and your gifts, whatever they may be, are unique to you as a person and only you as a person. And the way that you develop and the way that you heal and the even the mediumship that you might manifest is wholly unique to individuals. And there is no cookie cutter method of doing it. There's no quick way. But on the other hand, you don't have to have other people tell you who you are, because the whole point of spiritualism, it's one of the words that is used instead of necessarily spiritual development. The word that tends to be used is spiritual unfoldment, where it's you becoming you. And
Love
you
it.
have your guides there to help you and your ancestors, and that's what you need, and that's all you have to. That's really it. That is spiritualism, is that unfolding spiritual development between you, your spirits, God, nature, and all of that. And you don't need anything else. Like in spiritualism, there are no, at least in American spiritualism, there are no initiations. There's no anything. It just boils down to you working on your own healing and your own development, and that's all you need. Like you don't have to worry about comparing yourselves to other people. It's just you.
Just like, it's not that complicated, bro.
It's not. People make everything so
it's not that complicated. It's you in spirit. That's
so
it.
Funny. I do have like a funny little story. So I've taught a couple different classes in various places and stuff like that. I was teaching like a mediumship, like an introduction to mediumship class, and the way I teach is I don't tell people how to do things. I just tell them like, here are your tools, go do them.
That's exactly how I teach too.
And so one time I was going through the different kinds of mediumship, and this woman just like stopped me and she was like, wait, I've been doing this all along, and this is what mediumship is. And she was like, no one ever told me. And it was just, and it's crazy because people may actually be experiencing like these forms of mediumship, but because it's not one specific kind, like people just shut themselves down. They're like, well, I can't do anything like this. And it's just, it's crazy to me because she'd been doing it all along. She didn't even need to teach the class. She could have taught the class. Like, but she had been telling herself like, this isn't me, and it was her.
Awesome. And that's the lesson that I think we're all here to learn, right? Is that we all have that gift. And it was a gift to have you on this show tonight. And honestly, we should definitely do it again. We should have our own podcast, because I feel like this is such a vibe.
I would love that.
But yeah, no, seriously, thank you so much, Stephen, for coming on and for sharing your wisdom. I want to thank everyone who showed up to our live tonight. Let's do a few shout outs. We have Zelma, Stephen, Tyrone, Robert, Winter, Lovetta. I love that. Triple Hair, Val, Simply. Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight, and those of you who are going to be watching on the replay. Right? We are live here, Facebook, YouTube. Make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. And most importantly, remember, this is how we grow.
Yes.
Bye, guys.